Hi guys, it's Rory here and welcome to the Football Heritage Podcast. Hope you're enjoying everything that our fantastic podcast has to offer so far this year. Firstly, I'm here to tell you that our brand new patron exclusive feed, the Football Heritage Extra, is now live. You can subscribe for £3 per month and that gives you access to an additional exclusive podcast every Thursday. We've designed our patron exclusive content to be a wee bit more casual, more niche and full of exclusive insights and interviews with our friends, contributors and other people working within football. Links to subscribe are in all of our episodes, show notes as always. Looking forward to seeing you over there. Secondly, if you enjoyed last week's show, it would mean the world to us if you could leave a review on Apple and Spotify, or if you're listening on YouTube, a comment and a like. It really helps the algorithm pick us up and does so much for pushing us in front of new listeners every week. Please remember as well to leave a comment on our episodes on whichever platform you're listening on. One of our favourite things is engaging with you guys and being able to speak with you about the conversations that we're having every week. Lastly, please remember to visit our website to read our articles and see what other projects we're working on at the moment. Or if you like, come and join us on our social media for daily posts and content related to the heritage of football across the world. We're always up for a chat, so if you have any questions, suggestions or feedback, feel free to DM us on any of our socials or email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. I think that's about everything that I need to plug at the moment. Thanks once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host Rory Bryce and I'm joined this afternoon firstly by Colin Whelan.
Hello, I'm your Rory.
Good to have you back on, Colin. Thanks very much for joining us. And I'm also joined for the first time by Stephen Herbert.
Hello, hi Colin, hi Rory.
It's great to have you on, Stephen. Thanks very much for joining us. And today we are going to be talking all about Scotland at the World Cup. Obviously, with us putting on a World Cup programme of content, I was not going to miss the opportunity to talk about Scotland going to the first World Cup in 28 years, and just a little bit more generally about the history of us going to the World Cup. Now, the last time Scotland went to a World Cup was 1998 when I was 2 years old. So I have had to draft some help in to talk about this today from people of a certain vintage who who were alive during other tournaments that Scotland played in. Now, obviously, our listeners will be familiar with Colin Whelan. Colin is an author, recently retired, who has just published a new book called Super Squad Scotland. This is very much in the theme of his first book, Super Squad, but it goes through the different Scottish players where Colin effectively picks out his best ever Scotland squad, but with an eye to telling stories about the players that you might not have heard before, particularly with a focus on those with maverick identities, those who are rogues. This is really in line with the other podcast that we've done with Colin on Stan Bowles, where he talks about these different players who had character and a little bit more about them. Colin, you've obviously been in this podcast before. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself just before we get started.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, I took up the idea of writing a book a couple of years ago about Super Squad, and that basically it was the 60s and 70s players that played in the English First Division and had the greatest impact, I felt. A collection of 23 players, because in those days, those were the squads you took to World Cups, a squad of 23 players. So I just drew up a list of the 23 players I thought were the most influential during the 60s and 70s in English football. And now, I've moved on to the second book, which was, it came about an idea last November with a mate in a pub. It's 4 days after Scotland qualified for the first World Cup in 28 years. Because wanted to write a book about Super Squad Scotland. We had a few ideas ourselves about sort of who would immediately be in the squad. I'm pleased to say that not one of the players that he suggested is actually in the squad. I've gone back to my own variation of the team that I want to put together, or the squad I want to put together. And really, it's been an absolute labour of love, actually, sort of doing the research on all the great players that Scotland have actually played with the whole year, all the time they've been together. But what this is about, this is actually more about a what-if scenario. This is putting together a collection of Scotland's greatest players over the years, but we're actually going to an imaginary World Cup. We're going to play against the greatest ever teams put together in history. So you've got Brazil's greatest players, Holland's greatest players, England's greatest players, whatever. They're all going to compete in the same sort of imaginary World Cup. It's a what-if scenario. That's all it is. It's a bit of fun. Mm-hmm. But essentially, it's about sort of, okay, I put the team and squad together and we can debate it. We can have the arguments about it. Because, let's be honest, it's my book, so I put a couple of wild card players in there. you can scratch your head about. But, I think I argue effectively for their inclusion.
Excellent. We should say at the time of recording it's the 15th of May, so once this episode is out, Colin's book will be available to buy for everyone who is listening at the moment. So we'll put links in the show notes of this episode so people can go and pick that up. Now, Steve is my fellow countryman, person that I chose to invite on to talk about Scotland at the World Cup and his experience of not so much following the team, but at least being around and watching the games in pubs up and down the country, going to Hampden Park from his native Aberdeen. But right now, Stephen is actually based up in Barrow in the northwest of England, where he's heavily involved with Barrow AFC. Stephen, do you want to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself just before we get started?
Okay, as I said, I'm Steve Herbert. I'm an Aberdeen fan from must have been quite many sins, although like most Aberdeen fans, I'm always very happy to talk about things that happened about 40 years ago rather than right now. I work in a school. I'm the head of a school here in Barrow in Furness. I've been head of a supporters trust. I've been on the board at Barrow AFC. We have a stake in it as well. I do a little bit of writing for the fanzine. I've got a small social enterprise thing that I run through various schools to get kids playing football. And I'm generally a football nut, really, I think would be the best description. I've got great memories of nearly, I think, as a vintage as Collins. Looking forward to discussing that because, of course, the thing you need to understand for our younger listeners, which is probably basically everyone, is that Scotland have only won 4 games at World Cup finals in total.
Yes.
That being the case, I think Colin's idea of a fantasy World Cup that maybe doesn't exist except in some fevered magical realism is a really good idea because frankly, the reality, although evocative in its own way, is somewhat more prosaic.
Well, I'll give my predictions later on in this episode because this is going to be one of the first episodes that goes out as part of our World Cup content programme. I actually think it's going to be the second. So I'll give my predictions at the end of this episode. I mean, as Stephen said there, obviously, Scotland didn't take part in a World Cup until the 1950s. Until then, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales weren't members of FIFA due to a dispute, so they didn't actually take part in any of the World Cups. And I've always thought to myself, what could have been? Obviously, for Scotland being the home of international football, the first recognised international fixture played up at the West of Scotland Cricket Ground up in Partick, Scotland versus England. You'd like to think that if we did attend the World Cup in Uruguay, that very first tournament, we could have done some damage. And what's actually funny is that within the USA team that actually took part in that World Cup, there were 5 Scottish people and Scottish players who played representing the USA, but they weren't, second generation, third generation Scots. There were people who'd moved from Scotland to the USA a few years ago who turned out for the team, So we've had our fair run of bad luck, but what's always been great about the Scotland at the World Cup story, as miserable as it is that we've also created some of the best moments in the tournament that, like you said, Stephen, similar to Aberdeen fans liking to talk about things that happened 40 years ago, we'll always love Nery's Toepoke. We will always love Archie Gemmill against the Netherlands. And now the next chapter in that was that magnificent 4-2 win over Denmark. I mean, that was just absolutely incredible. Out with those 3 matches, we've not had a huge amount to scream and shout about at World Cups, unfortunately.
No, I mean, it was interesting. I was reading. For those of you that don't know who Brian Glanville is, of course, Colin will very much. He described the decision for them not to bother going to, I think it was America, as baffling insularity. Now, who would have ever accused the SFA of baffling insularity before? But that's that was the refusal to send the team, which I rather liked when I was reading that before. And they didn't cover themselves in glory pretty much after that either in terms of the preparation. So, a customary start. We're exactly the same about the European Cup. My father never forgave either SFA or Hibs because it had actually been Aberdeen that had won the league that year. SFA, it was Hibs fancied going in it, so they thought they put Hibernian in it rather than the actual league champions. So, they've surpassed themselves over many generations.
I'd say so. What's always quite interesting for me, obviously, being a younger fan, it's actually mental to think that there's a generation of supporters who've seen us qualify for 2 Euros and now a World Cup in the space of 10 years. Like, they must think that Scotland are one of the best teams in the world. The period of me being aware of Scotland and, following Scotland has been absolutely turgid. I mean, that 3-0 game against Kazakhstan is probably the lowest point. But I think that's what makes it all the more surprising for me and people of my generation, is that we qualified for 5 consecutive World Cups between 1974 and 1990. We had one of, just looking at the team on paper with the managers that we had, we should have done so much more. And I think it would be fair to say that we did underperform, although, Colin, that's something that you dispute.
I think so, Roy. The 74 to 95 years, 5 consecutive World Cups qualified. They drew Brazil in 3 of those group stages. And you're fighting for second place then. Always fighting for second place. And so, you're bound to come up, and straight. You're talking about sort of 78, they drew Holland. Holland were, sort of the finest from the previous World Cup, without Cruyff this time. They've always had a tough group. And in fact, in 86 they were drawn in the group of death with Uruguay, Denmark, and West Germany. That's what Brazil. They've always had a tough group to get out of. And I think it's just how the cards fell, isn't it? It's just sort of they didn't quite get. Occasional exceptional performances notwithstanding, they probably found their level. They were not. You could possibly say the 80s. I don't know. It's between the 74 to 70 and the 82 team, which was the best. 74, they returned 3 games undefeated. That was only on goals scored as well. Brazil got past Scotland because they scored one more goal in the group stages, and they'd actually drawn with Brazil 0-0 in their match in the group. And then 82, they had their chance against Russia in the last game of the group. If they'd beaten Russia, they would have got through to the next phase, and they'd taken the lead 1-0, and then Russia got back into it, and there was an absolute calamity in the halfway line between Hansen and Miller. And this goes back to the fact, you look at the team selection that day, and both of those guys, Alan Hansen and William Miller, are basically the number 6s. They're the guys that stand next to the centre half. They're the ball players, bring the ball out. And Jock Steiner decided to play both of them as a centre half pairing. And there's some stage they're going to bump into each other, and they did. They bumped into each other. The ball ran loose. Russian guy ran from the halfway line and rounded late and scored. It was those type of things that the things that shouldn't have happened but did happen. The draw with Iran, the defeat to Peru in 78, always put them on the back foot. They had some wonderful performances to try and mitigate against that. But at some stage they were just, I think they were found wanting.
We're the masters of shooting ourselves in the foot, I think. And while we obviously, there is a great deal of luck and, in Scotland's case, unluckiness involved in that, I think that we do have a habit of creating problems for ourselves, and this is why we've found ourselves in the position that we're in over the last 20 or 30 years or so.
Yeah, definitely.
I think you're being incredibly kind. 1974, I'll absolutely give you. Although, to be honest, all I could tell you about 1974 was you were made by your mother to wear really, really uncomfortable velour shirts. And the only 3 words I remember from the 1974 World Cup at the time, because I was 6, is Yabba, Dabba, and Do, which are the 3 from the World Cup song. But we had a great side, and setting a pattern, if you like, the template for the rest of the time, where you just simply slightly failed to exert any sufficient pressure on the poorest team in the group. And played rather well and had a good side. 78, I was 10, and so therefore I believed Ali McLeod. I rewatched the goals and highlights this morning from the Peru game, much to my wife's chagrin. And that side, Tubulas was fabulous, but that in the Iran game, that side should have at least drawn with Peru and certainly beaten Iran. And they didn't even scout Iran. The
No,
hotel was terrible.
no, no.
They played Don Masson and Bruce Rioch, who were right out of form. Being an Aberdeen fan, they should have played Joe Harper in every position from the start to the finish. And believe me, if it was 10, I did actually believe that.
Yeah. No, Steve was right. You weren't around at the time, Rory, but you would have known about Annie McLeod whipping up a frenzy in Scotland. That we're off to Argentina to win the World Cup. And plenty of people believed them.
Yep.
And there was a parade before they flew out to Argentina. And no one knows what that was about. There's about whipping up support. They just lost to England in the home internationals. They'd lost at Hampden Park 1-0. There was something sort of going on there that's telling you that Scotland were not as invincible as Alan McLeod had made out. But, he was a great manager in terms of whipping up a frenzy and a false expectation. The first match, that was it. Peru winning 3-1. And going back to Stephen's point about, there was some good midfield players there. He touched on Masson and Rioch being out of form, but they're also a little bit old. They were the first choices, but at the same time, you would have brought in as soon as these had been played earlier. Gemmell was playing. There was one or two things that were just missing, and essentially it's because the manager.
Yeah, no, spot on. Managers is something that we'll certainly come on to speak about, I think, later on, because Scotland have had many who are incredibly unpopular, many strange appointments. We'll talk about this a bit later on as well, the general Scottish mentality towards football and life in general, how that translates in the pitch, be described as dour, pretty turgid, pretty miserable. I mean, the thing is, Colin, I've spoken with so many people on this podcast now who are from south of the border, and, there's always this sense of, obviously there's a rivalry between England and Scotland, and no one says there's not, but there's always been this sense of, well, if England aren't doing so well at a World Cup, then loads of people like seeing Scotland do well, or Wales, or Northern Ireland.
Yeah, of course.
Not the same in any of those countries the other way around, though.
I understand that.
Yep. So, I mean, what was it like for you as an English person, and obviously a follower of the England national team? What was your perception of Scotland at this point? Because like I said at the beginning, we can look back on it with hindsight and say, well, we probably underperformed there, but you've always been of the opinion that we were very much in our station, if maybe sometimes even overachieving.
I'd say the sense that I got, and this is in the book, I mean, sort of go into in greater detail in an introduction about my introduction to the Scottish national team. I'm an England supporter, but I'd also support any other home nation. And Scotland just happened to be at 2 World Cups that England weren't at in the 70s, in 74 and 78. But I would well remember in 1978, where the Daily Mirror, as it was at the time, they had a sports journalist called Frank McGee. And I don't think he was Scottish, but I remember his prediction before the 78 World Cup. He fully expected Brazil to win the World Cup, but they may have to overcome Scotland in the final. Now, obviously he was wrapped up in McLeod mania at the time, like a lot of people were. But, Scotland went with certainly the English press's best wishes. I distinctly remember that, and certainly for me and my pals at school, we all wanted Scotland to do well. I mean, it didn't matter to us that England weren't there. It wasn't okay. You had a team to support. The most important thing in those days was you had a feast of live football.
Yeah,
the stuff everyone takes for granted now. We never had that back in those days. We had, if the World Cup was on, you made sure that you watched every game you could. It was fantastic. You had to have a team to support. And it was Scotland, and we did. We fell in love with them beforehand, and Raggy fell out of love with them during the tournament. But it was we still support them. But great memories. They really were. And going back to Stephen's point about under preparation of Scotland, McLeod in '78. Yeah, it was. It didn't come out until much later.
Yeah.
No scouting be done on the. I think Peru were actually the South American champions at the time.
Yeah, they were. They were a really good side.
We won't bother watch any of their players. I mean, they're beating Argentina, they're beating Uruguay, they're beating Brazil on the way.
Exactly.
And they weren't even prepared to scout them,
And this is what I'm saying about having the benefit of hindsight, because we might look back now and think, Iran, Peru, these nothing teams in air quotes, when actually these guys had really, really good sides at this point in time. And just to go back to what you mentioned about 82 as well, you mentioned that horrific defensive error which led to the two of them running into each other for the Soviets to go on, and the goal which ultimately condemned Scotland to not qualifying. The Brazil team that beat Scotland 4-1 in that group had Socrates, Zico, Falcao in it.
A lot.
And but they still turned out a good performance against New Zealand. And it's just if it wasn't for that one fuck up, who knows what could have happened. But obviously then moving on from 82, you had 86. And I mean, I think it would be fair to say, given the circumstances of how Scotland qualified, obviously with Jockstein passing away on the touchline, there's a bit of a cloud over the players, and we saw in the modern day how that can affect footballers regardless of what tournament they're playing in. It was a real tragedy that happened.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember the disbelief very well, actually. We were at Celtic Park quite soon. I don't know whether it was the game after. There was a tribute, and I remember the wreaths from all both sets of supporters all around the stadium when they came out and complete, unanimity. The person who was, the greatest manager we ever had. So yeah, that was unbelievable. And I think it put everything in slight perspective. Ferguson, who I was never convinced was absolutely desperate to be the Scotland manager. I mean, he was thrust into somewhere when he was left to do his best. He wasn't. I mean, I know we're going to talk about Mavericks later. He wasn't fabulous on. He didn't brook much opposition, did Fergie? And I think some of the more Maverick players didn't get. I seem to remember didn't get to go or didn't get a start. There were moments. I think the Uruguay game, unfortunately, which I watched in Cambridge in a pub, much to the delight of the entire pub, Stevie Nicol, and I can still see myself at the bar in Cambridge laughing English people while Stevie Nicol missed that. It descended rather badly for over the next 24 hours, culminating me in me waking up in a house in Cambridge. I had no idea how I got there. With nobody in it, in a front room, and I managed to get into bed somewhere with nobody in it, the door completely wide open, completely deserted in this lovely Muse house, and I walked out, and still to this day, probably for the best, I have absolutely no idea how I got there. So for that respect, that's my memory of the 86 World Cup sort of ends with Stevie Nichol's missing sort of a vague in a Muse Street in Cambridge. So that's that was a very odd. I mean, that was a very odd time socially. Anyway, if it came down from, I'd come down. I was living in Fife, and I'd come to work in the south of England, and everybody. It was just a very different world in 1986 in southern England than it was in Fife. So different that when I decided that it wasn't for me, I went back to sign on in Scotland, and they said, "Well, why are you signing back on, Mr. Herbert?" And I said, "Alienation with the lifestyle in the south of England." And they said, "No bother, pal, you'll get your job on Friday." And that was somewhat difficult. So those are not terribly connected memories of the World Cup. I think we had quite a good side, but we couldn't cope with Germany's dark arts. That Denmark side was decent, I think, and Germany were Germany, and Uruguay were incredibly difficult and playing on their own continent. So I suppose, Colin, I think that one particularly, I'll give you. It's for me. It's all defined by '78. I'm still that 10-year-old. I'm still in therapy. I'm still that 10-year-old boy who, when Ali said retain it, when they asked him what he was going to do after the World Cup, the sides, Joe Jordan strikes faster than British Leyland. That was which for those of you is a wonderfully 70s banner that is. And because I was 10, I was still singing it when we went out, when we went on holiday. It's the first time we went abroad. And I was still singing in the plane to Ali's Tartan Army, even though we were out, because when you're 10, you just like singing things repetitively and playing the entire plane. So
no, that's fair enough. We'll go from that to something that might traumatise you a little bit more. Tell us about Andy Roxburgh.
Andy Roxburgh.
Yeah, in the book there's a chapter on selecting the manager. Before I decide upon the manager or managerial team that will take Scotland into this fancy World Cup, I actually assessed all the candidates, sort of from Willie Ormond, Jock Dean, Andy Roxburgh, Craig Brown, and all that. Now, I'm just looking at the what I've written up about Andy Roxburgh. Right, so he was manager 86 to 93, 61 games, and a win percentage of 38%. And it got Scotland to the 1990 World Cup and the 92 Euros. Back in those days, it was 8 teams. So Scotland were one of the 8 best teams in Europe at the time. So that was no mean achievement at all. And I'm just sort of reading my notes here. So he's a huge influence in the coaching, but he's more of a coach rather than the manager. I don't think he had that sort of man management skill. He was very technical. Yeah, he even worked on with FIFA as a member of the technical committee. But fair play to him, he got 2 teams to major champion, say a World Cup and 92 Euros. But he never ever striked you as a manager. He didn't have any sort of forbearance as a manager. There was no charisma about him. You wouldn't have sort of looked at him and said, well, yeah, it's probably more in your profession, Steve. So he's probably more a school teacher, head teacher, that type of thing. That's what he looked like.
He did. And he managed Scotland, and the actual results were okay. It's just something about him. He was I'm talking, however old, I was a 20-odd-year-old. Thinking about that, there were a lot of exciting things happening when you were 20 in Scotland, or 22 in Scotland in 1990. Living in Edinburgh, and Andy Roxburgh wasn't one of them really. He had a reasonable. He had a reasonable side, but all I can hear is a despairing disaster. So that was it. Yeah, it's an interesting World Cup. If I should have gone to one, it's probably that. Italy is very much a evocative home of football in its own way. We had a reasonable side. The highlight apparently was Roy Aitken taking his teeth out. I think and they were on the. And Murdo McLeod getting knocked out. We played all right against Scandinavians, which we quite often do. Had a disaster, and then had another disaster for playing Brazil, which we again always do. and it was an awful Brazil team in 1990. I think.
And that's what I was going to say, because there was an opportunity there for us, and we almost, again coming back to this idea of bad luck, we were almost there until Jim Leighton fumbled that shot.
Yeah,
and then that's it over.
And then, before the end, there was a chance Scotland to score. The Brazilian keeper made an unbelievable save.
Oh, Taffarel, yeah, he makes that save. I was in an indeterminate flat in South Clark Street in Edinburgh. Although slightly more joyous than the Cambridge incident was, in terms of just sort of, it was grindingly. In my mind, it was sometime around tea time that we kicked off, and it was just grindingly. By that time, having got done, I'd got used to the sort of modus operandi. So it was just absolutely, head and hands. That people always forget because in Scotland we have people from other countries playing, like Paddy Bora, for whom the 1990 World Cup is a wonderful moment of Irish fabulousness, and Jerry Armstrong's goal for Northern Ireland, and I'm pretty sure England did all right. So everybody gets certainly the English get very nostalgic about 1990, and it did make an incredible cultural impact. But the football was terrible.
Yeah, it was.
And Scotland were not great. But it's wonderful. It's apropos of nothing. It's where Scottish ultra season began. Steve McCormick was who's a fan activation guy at Aberdeen, was in Genoa for the World Cup.
A lot of inspiration taken from the Italian supporters and how they conducted themselves at World Cup. And obviously Italia 90 is much loved massively within the football nostalgia and retro football community. It is really the go-to tournament for that. Then obviously we miss USA 94, and I think the less said about 98 the better, to be honest, because despite a draw with Norway, it's a pretty dismal tournament, which is a real shame because Craig Brown's obviously remembered very fondly by Scotland fans, and you always got the feeling that more should have been done for him by the players to deliver at that tournament. And to be fair, it's probably quite a fitting end to Scotland's World Cup journey for nearly 30 years.
Yeah. I remember 98, the first match, they're playing Brazil. Brazil's in the team again. Took the lead. There's a penalty. Scotland took the lead.
John Collins, yeah.
And it was. I was in the pub at the time, straight after work, and it was a pandemonium. Again, everyone, the pub in London had a great early evening, and then obviously Brazil scored twice, and that was the end of that. Again, and then Norway, Craig Birdie scored, didn't he? And then they had to beat Morocco, didn't they, in the final game? And I know Jim Leighton struggled in that game. He was coming towards the end of his career anyway. But there was soft 3-0, weren't they? And that was that was ended very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so 98 happened, 98 came and went, and until obviously back in November there, Scotland hadn't even sniffed World Cup qualification. I mean, I remember we played Ukraine a couple of years back, but apart from that, we were just nowhere near it. Bertie Vogt's era saw us drop to 76th, 77th or something like that in the world rankings. I mean, I was still quite young to remember it, but I remember how miserable my dad was over it. And then growing up sort of late 2000s into the 2010s, I could not have been less interested in the national team. I could not have been less interested because it was just the same constant cycle of making mistakes, not taking advantage of either the opposition we were playing with, the players that we had, playing the same terrible brand of football, and just like constantly shooting ourselves in the foot to the point where we weren't getting anywhere. And then, obviously, during the pandemic, Scotland managed to qualify for Euro 2020, what would become Euro 2021. And, that was amazing. That was the first time I'd seen us qualify for anything in my living memory. Amazing. Then we qualify for Euro 2024, obviously beating Spain on the way to that. Absolutely amazing. But we always wanted to be at the World Cup. And, obviously there was a Denmark game, but there were some other important results during that qualification campaign as well. Obviously drawn with Denmark over there, beating Greece 3-1. And then that game, just from obviously Scott McTominay's overhead kick, phenomenal. But 3 of the 4 goals that Scotland scored could have been goal of the qualifiers. Absolutely incredible night.
But it's almost like, it was always considered amongst all Scottish fans the greatest goal Scotland ever scored ever was the Archie Gemmill goal against Holland. And all of a sudden you get 2 goals in one match that surpass the Gemmill game. It surpasses the Gemmill goal entirely because of the quality, and they were just unbelievable. I mean, again, I was watching it in the pub as you do as you get older, and it's a fantastic atmosphere. It really was, especially the goal from the halfway line.
Getting goosebumps talking about it. Just such an incredible night. And now we're back to World Cup 2026. It's been an incredible journey, but obviously that's been the history of Scotland in the World Cup. Colin, tell us a little bit more about your book and the squad that you have put together in it and some of your justifications for it.
Okay. Well, first of all, keep it simple in terms of the qualification group we have. Scotland are in the qualification group they have in 2026. So they're playing Haiti, they're playing Morocco, and they're playing Brazil. So you play them, and then, I'm going to let you into a secret. Okay, they do get out of the qualification group. Okay, I'll say no more than that. They get out of the qualification group. Okay, we're talking about, go back to the wild picks. Okay, so the goalkeepers. No Jim Leighton, okay? No Jim Leighton. I'm really sorry. I know, looking at it, I've gone for David Harvey, 74 goalkeeper, Andy Gorham, and Craig Gordon. Now, David Harvey, Gorham, and Craig Gordon, they're in it. They're definitely going to be in it. But 3 goalkeepers, I've gone for David Harvey. And the reason why is because in 1974, during that World Cup, he was voted the best goalkeeper in the World Cup. Now, he'd only played 3 games, but he's voted ahead of Sepp Maier, Tomaszewski, the clown that kept England at the World Cup in 73, 74, and keeper Jan Youngblood. So David Harvey's time with Scotland was well spent. He only featured in 16 games, but he had an accident. He had a car accident the season after 75, and essentially curtailed his career. So I've gone for him over Jim Leighton. So the defenders, you'll love this too. We've got a McLeish-Miller partnership first choice, okay? And I've written about them as a unit rather than individuals. I've written about them as a unit, the 2 of them together. And I've gone Danny McGrain and Andy Robertson as the fullbacks, okay? And then there's 4 other defenders there. I've gone Hansen and Billy McNeil are the backup centre pairing. And I've gone Tommy Gemmell and I've gone John Gregg for the backup full backs. Okay, so midfield, who have I got? So I've got Bremner and Souness, centre midfield pairing.
That's a hard midfield.
Yeah, you're not getting much past that, are you? So I've got Darren Fletcher and Scott McTominay as well from the modern era. McTominay, come on.
No, you need to have McTominay in there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Darren Fletcher, massively underrated. He was absolute quality for United.
I think
he
was, and I think in another era of Scotland he would have been.
Yeah. He'd been standard. Yeah. And then I've gone back to so the rest of the squad is Dave Mackay, Archie Gemmell.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you have him in there.
Jim Baxter. Now, this is my wild card.
Okay.
We've got a guy who never ever played for Scotland, John McGovern. Captain's Forest, twice European Cup final winner. That I want that guy in our squad, John McGovern. I really, really rated that guy. He was everywhere, always there, always available for a pass, always able to release a pass very, very quickly. So he's in the team, okay? So the forward line is everything that you'd expect. So you got Dennis Thorne, Kenny Dalglish. They're playing together, their first choice up front. Back up, Joe Jordan and Ali McCoist, Andy Gray. And I've got Jimmy Johnson and John Robertson as the wingers. Okay, around one or two of the wild cards, there's discussion about that, particularly about John McGovern, I know that. But I think sort of all the great players that have ever played for Scotland are there. And I think in midfield is the hardest category out of all of them. And I'm saying that sort of Scotland have had fantastic players in midfield. You're talking about Gary McAllister, he's not even in the squad. And a few Celtic players that I've not included. And I'm just saying, sort of they're excellent, but they're not as great as these guys. The guys I've actually chosen.
Yeah, and as much as I have my biases and my own opinions about him, there's a strong argument that you could have Barry Ferguson in there, though obviously given what happened with him and Alan McGregor with the national team, there's a lot of people who wouldn't want that, and I can understand that as well. I'd argue heavily for Callum McGregor to be in that squad as well, but again, maybe another player that's probably not been blessed with the period of time he's played with Scotland when he was playing at his peak for Celtic at least. But yeah, I mean, obviously that's my opinion. Steve, what about you?
Okay, well, a lot of that, I agree with a lot of that. I didn't know about David Harvey. That completely passed me by, and that is a good justification. However, obviously, the whole point of Leighton, Miller, and McLeish is to come as a triumvirate, and if you're going to play them, then they need to go as a triumvirate. Then you're better playing them as that. And I think folk slightly not denigrate, but forget that Leighton single-handedly got us to the World Cup post his disaster at Man United, saved a penalty in Iceland.
Yeah,
would have been possibly the 98 one, possibly 90, but he was great for Scotland. So I don't agree about Jim Leighton, although I understand that.
The thing that I would say as well, for every single admission, a controversial admission like Jim Leighton, I've offered justification, and I've written some nice things about the guys that I've had to exclude. And in fact, for every single one of the players I have included, I've written up a 500-word biopic about the guys as well, and why they deserve to be in the team.
What's the can I ask? Did I hear right? Was Sandy Jardine in that Scotland?
No, I've gone for Tommy Gemmell. Tommy Gemmell and John Gregg. John Gregg's in there because I think he's the ultimate right back for Rangers. Not just playing ability, but who he was. And Tommy Gemmell because of the fact he was 2-footed. And I do like 2-footed fullbacks, and Danny McGrain was one of those as well.
McGrain is absolutely indisputably has to be in there. I think that's probably, you have your favourites from growing up, and it's probably more my era. I probably would have said, I would have said Jardine. I'd certainly had him in the squad.
Well, am I right in saying as well, Colin, that Gordon Strachan wasn't in the squad at all either?
No, that's right.
He's another one that could. Yeah, I mean, I would argue for his inclusion. Absolutely, yeah, it's another one you could have in there.
Yeah. Oh, you could, but and people wouldn't necessarily know so much about Dave Mackay, for instance. But that guy was a force of nature. He was Footballer of the Year in Scotland and in England. He won the double in Scotland and in England as well with Hearts and Spurs. He was an unbelievable player. He really, really was. And you've got to have Jim Baxter. I haven't seen. I've read loads about the guy, and what a character he was. But unbelievable. You watched the 67 match against England, and you won't get the whole match, but you get half hour sort of clips of it. He's that one guy on the pitch who just has half a second longer than everyone else does on the ball. He just it's the way he controls the ball and then lets it go very quickly, and he just took such a class act. He really did.
And in the similar vein as McGovern, like you mentioned, I'm really glad you mentioned McGovern actually. Another Forest player, Stuart Imlach, who played at the 1958 World Cup.
Yeah.
Stuart Imlach had an absolutely incredible career down south, particularly for Nottingham Forest.
And hadn't considered him at all, Roy.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many other players that you don't even consider that could. There's arguments to be made for them to be included, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of fun. Yeah, that's the whole point of sort of the introduction. Is a bit of fun. Come on, let's all debate it. You know, I'd love to have a massive night out in a pub with shout across the table. That, you know, I'd love that.
There'll be people having an absolute fit that we haven't just started with McNeil and Greg. I mean, there's both, you know, obviously I won't be. I would be, but you know, I mean, McNeil was an unbelievable player. Greg as well, actually, and
yeah, of course.
And amazing not to be able to include McAllister. I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. But I think possibly, I suppose if you put McAllister and Dave Mackay together, you've got to pick Dave Mackay. You know,
yeah.
And because just on things one,
that's it. But it's a very, very flexible squad, and the manager is very flexible, and he's very, very good with. You know, when it comes to tournament football, the manager is fantastic with his substitutions. I'll say no more, so everyone gets a game. But the first game, they're playing Haiti, and Darren Fletcher and Scott McTominay are playing with Souness and Bremner. It's not how many finishes, you know, but this is the way tournament.
I mean, the worry for me is that a midfield of Souness and Bremner, like one of them is getting sent off in every game that they play, at least. Like that is an aggressive midfield.
It's a deterring midfield. It means the likes of Spain won't be playing the fancy dance stuff around the woolly. The snarling hostility, I call it. They're at them all the time, basically.
A sense of love of the early 70s Leeds side. I'm not entirely sure about the width, but as a box midfield, it's absolute assault. You know, it's an absolute assault. I mean, the Bremner slightly before my time.
Yeah,
he was sort of on the party circuit by then. But I think, and although I feel a little bit difficult even saying the word Souness, he was a player. He was once he really was. He was once what was he described as at Tottenham. If it was chocolate, he would eat himself. That was it.
Oh, yeah.
As you mentioned the managers there, Colin, obviously, I kind of alluded to this earlier. With the managers that Scotland have had over the years, you've always felt that our managers have been people who've been there and done it at different levels, and they can just never really make it translate onto the field of Scotland.
Yeah.
And obviously also alluded to the fact that Scotland have historically played quite a drab, Route 1 industrial type of football. That's me being quite diplomatic. And under the current manager, Steve Clarke, despite the fact he's taken us to 2 Euros and a World Cup, there's a lot of people that aren't happy with him. It feels funny saying that. There's a lot of people that are quite fed up with Clarke's style of play. And as someone who's obviously a fan of nice free-flowing attacking football, with the current crop of players that we've got, a lot of people are a bit worried that this could be another opportunity missed.
Well, I think Steve Clarke is hiding his creative light under some sort of very, very, very well-covered bushel at the moment. I don't know. I think he's got some. I mean, you can't say, how does somebody that is so hilariously dour manage to have a team to produce that moment?
It's true.
Those moments. How is that possible? It's one of the most unlikely scenarios. It's like Alex Ferguson being nice to journalists, or Tommy Doherty not copping off with the physio's wife, or all the thinking back on Martin O'Neill isn't going to go after everybody in the press conference, David, there is no succulent lamb at David Murray's table. I mean, it's that surprise. It's all the sort of Scottish football shibboleths, if you like, are completely done. So I think he's laughing. I think he's sitting somewhere in some sort of Hawaiian-like garden in a Hawaiian shirt, watching reruns of Carry On films and laughing uproariously at French, laughing uproariously at French farce, and it's all a complete facade. And he doubled down by being absolutely appallingly depressing at the Euros previously. And hey, I don't know. I think he will genuinely talk about enjoying it. But certainly for my generation, I never thought we'd see. I mean, I was at the stage where I never thought we'd see it back. I'm just delighted for your younger Scottish fans that they can see that, they can come to that. But I just wish, because this, looking at the group, this is doable. Eminently doable, and at least getting through the round. And whether or not he's about as likely to crack a smile as he will be the best ever
Oh yeah,
Scotland
no,
manager.
absolutely. If we get through, then there is absolutely the case to be made for that.
Absolutely
Yeah.
no question. And I just, it would wonderful if he just suddenly cut loose, a bit like Scotland did against Denmark. I mean, will he mirror that? Will he suddenly, will always all sorts of different possibilities?
Well, I spoke on our first World Cup content programme podcast about this, our World Cup, with Thor Logason, and he kind of said, well, I'm quite interested to see the big nations, because he's speaking with people from different diasporas within New York, basically asking them, what is your experience going to be the World Cup? And he said, like Italian fans, they didn't qualify, they were like, we're done with them, we're not going to bother. And I'm like, well, it's probably nice being World Cup champions, World Cup holders previously, and being able to say that within living memory, whereas for us, Scotland, and on a different level, Haiti, Iraq, Bosnia, other teams like Curacao, Cape Verde, for us, it's just about being there and being able to take in what is going to be the first World Cup since I was 2 years old. You pointed to it there. There's a new generation of Scottish people coming up who are watching the national team right now, and I hope for theirs, because I feel like I've done my time watching the shite that we've had to put up with over the last 30 years, and I hope they don't have to go through the same thing. I hope that they see us qualifying regularly enough for us not to be considered the whipping boys of every single tournament that we go to.
No, and it's good, and there's no reason why not. I mean, I can't even imagine if we manage to get out of a group, how crazy it will be. Yeah, well, so yeah, it's going to be marvellous, and despite those bits of reservations, you can't afford to be sniffy about it.
We'll finish up with our predictions then, Steve. Obviously, you've said that you think Scotland have a good chance of getting out of the group. So give us your predictions. As I said, I think this is going to be the second or third episode that goes out of this programme. So it's going to be right at the start, maybe just before or just after Scotland's first game against Haiti. So let's hear what your predictions are.
Okay, I think we'll beat Haiti. Probably we'll squeak past Haiti in an unconvincing fashion. There'll be rumblings of fearful lack of attacking, and we'll score from a corner with about 10 minutes to go and lumber our way over the line to endless speculation and claim and counterclaim from Tom English and co. Then we will play Morocco and surprise the life out of them and right the wrongs of 98 and stuff them 3-0. Then everybody will go completely insane and we'll be all beaters again for the first time since the aforementioned Joe Jordan strikes faster than British Leyland. And then we'll play Brazil and there'll be wild talk of topping the group and we'll get stuffed. But we'll still go through.
Who would you take in the knockout if we do go through?
We'll get somebody ridiculous like Argentina or something, we'll get something ridiculous and we'll hang on. That'll be one of those desperate Scotland rearguards, where you manage to, it's a 10 minute to go and Lionel Messi will slip past Grant Hanley.
That's not a very difficult thing for him to do.
He's not maybe they won't pick up somebody like that in the corner and they'll scramble home a goal and we'll get beat 1-0. We'll get a draw disallowed by VAR and we'll get beat 1-0 of Argentina and come home as heroes. And Steve Clark will smile.
Okay, that's your predictions. I wish I shared your optimism. I think we'll lose 3-0 to Haiti. I think we'll draw with Morocco. And I think we'll beat Brazil 2-1 after we've already been knocked out. That's the Scotland way of doing things.
Oh my days. As you really have embraced, there's a historian right there. You've embraced some of the worst cultural knife twists that we've had over the
That's the
years.
Scotland that I grew up with.
No, I think that you can't. We were stupidly incredible, and I just think something wonderful is going to happen.
I think we'll beat Haiti. I'm not going to put scorelines on it. I think we'll beat Haiti. I think we will just beat Morocco and we'll get beat off Brazil. And I think we will qualify. Like you said, I think this group is doable. I think the way that we've been playing and the style that Steve Clarke has set us up in, like we played against Spain and Denmark, it is more than feasible for us to be able to go and qualify from this group, I think. But more important to me, whatever happens, the reason that I am there is to see Scotland at a World Cup and mingle and experience some of the other cultures and supporters of other nations that will be there, because there's not a chance that we'll be able to get to do this. Again, knowing Scotland, that could be a very, very long time. Regardless of what happens to Scotland in the groups, I'm just going to be enjoying being there and seeing Scotland at a World Cup.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. Oh. We have an unbelievable time, I'm sure you will.
Hopefully so. We'll see how it goes. But Stephen, thank you very much for joining me on this episode this afternoon. Colin, thank you very much also. Thank you once again to all of our listeners who've tuned in to this episode as part of our World Cup content programme. Hope you enjoyed it. As I said, there was no way that we were doing this without getting an episode about Scotland in, so I appreciate you tuning in to hear us talking about all things Scotland, which tends to be quite miserable. But I like to think we have a good sense of humour about it, and that we do actually have a chance to qualify from the groups this World Cup.
Yabba dabba doo.
Yabba dabba doo. If you have any questions about this episode, then feel free to get in touch with us on social media or email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Otherwise, we'll see you all again in the next episode. Goodbye.